All right, so we are fastly jumping here. We're going to turn to Judges chapter 21. All right. So the filter for today's lesson is the question: how much do we trust God for our daily lives? How much do we trust God for our daily lives? So far we've gone through. We came out of Joshua. We had Moses. We had Joshua, and we jumped into the Judges, and we're quickly skirting over the Judges. They hit Gideon. And we've had Samson, and now we're skirting right off into Ruth. All right, so Judges chapter 21, verse 25 ends with, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes." Right? Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And that verse there describes what is called moral relativism, right? Morally, it's all relatable to you. So there's no absolute standard of right and wrong there. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Each person determines for himself there what is true for himself, what is best for himself. Right? Man putting himself in the place of God, determining what's right and wrong. Right? That's what they did then. Based on circumstances. Okay? Decisions, however, based on circumstances still affect people's lives. Okay? So we have to watch the circumstances, not be focused on circumstances, because that leads us astray, and the decisions that DECISIONS, right? English teachers, I'll dot my C, because that's the way that works, right? But as we jump from Gideon and Samson at the end of Judges and we jump into Ruth, the first verse picks up where Judges left off. "Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons was Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah, and they came into the country of Moab and continued there." All right, so here, as we end Judges, every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Right, and as we start off in Ruth, we see another example of that. I always like the beginning of that. "Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled." Right, it always reminds me of those books or whatever, movies, cartoons, whatever. It was the time when the dinosaurs ruled the earth. You know, I always think of that for some reason. I don't know why. But, you know, when the judges ruled, that's what's going on there. So we have in the time of Judges the story of Ruth. And we have a circumstance. And what is our circumstance? Famine. We have a famine in the land. Now, have we seen famine stories in the Bible before? Yeah, right? We've seen Abraham. Abraham has had famine issues a couple of times, and he famine in this area, so he goes over there, or he goes over there. Jacob and his family, that's how they got into Egypt, right? There were circumstances of famine there, and God scooted them over there, right? But what is the difference then between issues like what Abraham had and Jacob had and what's going on here with Elimelech? What's the difference? Chuck. Male and female? You're not Chuck. You're Sandy. But go ahead. There's women involved? So that caused the whole problem is because there was women? What?
Well, because in those days, it was probably impossible for a woman to live on her own.
Sure, you're jumping way ahead, though. because we're not there yet, right? Elimelech is still here. We got to lay some foundation first, Andy. You way super Petered me there. All right, Chuck, what do you got?
Just looking at Abraham and Jacob, and that they consulted God on their decisions. Because at Beersheba,
Right.
we got Jacob offering. Doesn't say what he asked God. Made a sacrifice, and it said God answered him.
Right.
Basically told him it's okay to go to Egypt. That just blows me away there. You know why, right? So,
Yeah. Right? So we've got the difference between Abraham, God told him, look, go over there. Jacob, look, go over there. It's fine. Go over there. Right? But what do we have going on here in Ruth? What's Elimelech doing? Making his mind up, right? Right? Elimelech went out on his own. Whatever. Now, who is Elimelech taking with him? His whole family. What's interesting about this account here? What's interesting about this story? What do we see here that we don't see in a lot of other stories? Randy? No. Yeah.
line of David, and, you know, but
Well-
he obviously wasn't too concerned about whether he was where he was supposed to be. He went where the food was.
Okay. Well, let's back up a step even from that. Who is going with him? What details are we given that we're not normally given in most stories? Huh? His wife, right? We know his wife's name. Who else? His children, right? He's got 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, right? Right? We have a whole family, and their names are spelled out. We don't normally see that, right? Even if you go back to Noah, right? We got Noah, and we got Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives' name was what? Exactly. Adam and Eve, Cain, Abel, Seth, you've got it there. But we don't often see this level of detail there. All right? So that's interesting. So we have the circumstances of the famine in Israel. And Elimelech, he took action. And what did he decide to do? In verses 1 and 2, what did he decide to do? Right? So he took off and he went where? Moab. All right? So now, did he belong in Moab? No, he didn't. Right? But he took his whole family with him, right? So in verses 3 through 5, let's take a look at that. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. And they took them wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelled there about 10 years. And Mahlon and Chilion died, also both of them. And the woman was left of her 2 sons and her husband. Okay, so how long were they there? 10 years. Why were they there in the first place? Famine, right? So, did Israel get wiped off the face of the earth because of this famine? No. Right? But they decided to go off on their own thinking they were better off. Okay? Which goes back to our filter question. How much do we trust God for our daily lives? Right? We trust Him for our salvation. His free gift we can't see. Our salvation we can't see. Our eternal home we can't see. But in our daily lives, for our food, our famine, right? When we start to see things directly affect us, how much do we trust God for our daily lives? Right? And that's kind of the filter that we're looking at here. So they spent 10 years there. So in 10 years, there was absolutely no food in Israel. Question mark? Wrong. Okay. So what happened in these 10 years? What happened to Elimelech? Did he? He's got a grave there, right? Elimelech is dead. Right? Elimelech died. That's how we go in verse 3. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. And she was left and her 2 sons. So right now, it is Naomi and the 2 sons that are left. What choice does she have? What choice does she have? All right. Do I go back home or do I stay here? What does she decide to do? She decides to stay, right? So here we have her making her own decision. She stays. So now, what husband and wife combo can you think of that they made a decision to do something wrong together, each independently? Think New Testament. There you go, right? We've got similarities there, right? He made a decision, she follows. Fine, great, wonderful, okay? Now, he's dead, she has a choice to make. She makes the same decision. She stays there. What happens now? What happens because she stayed? Boys get girls of the neighborhood. I like that, Peter. Right? They get married to Moabites, right? Is that who they should have gotten married to? No, right? Bible's clear on that. What happens to them? They're dead. Somewhere in that 10-year period, right? So we got Orpah and we got Ruth. And now these 2 die. So who's left? The women. And what does the woman decide to do now? Go back, right? So if we look at 3 through 5, we already read that. Ending in 5, and Mahlon and Chilion died, but also both of them, and the woman was left of her 2 sons and her husband. Verse 6, then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the country of Moab how that the Lord had visited his people in giving them bread. All right, so now there's bread in Israel again. So she's going, all right, forget this nonsense. I'm out of here, right? What is she looking for? What is her focus? Food, right? So her focus is survival. Focus is earthly. Focus is not necessarily God, but what she can get out of God, right? Because what did she hear? Well, it's not just that there was food, right? That God had provided food again, right? So there's a spiritual aspect that is also to it that she recognizes, right? And we had talked 3 weeks ago, about how Israel likes to play this balancing game between God and idols, right? God and the world, right? So here we have her doing clearly what she's not supposed to have been doing in a place where she shouldn't have been doing it, right? But somehow she still has half a testimony going on because it affects Ruth, and we see that, right? But it's kind of what she wants to get out of God as well. So she's moving back because of the death of the men, and now there's bread in Israel. So she's moving back. Naomi's going, and who else is going with? Right? All 3 of them. They're all going with. Which is funny. They're all packing up. They're all getting ready to go. And then Naomi drops this bombshell on them in 11 and 13. And Naomi said, turn again, my daughters. Why will you go with me? And are there yet any more sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Turn again, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have an husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have an husband also tonight, and should also bear sons, would ye tarry for them till they were grown? Would ye stay for them from having husbands? Nay, my daughters, for it grieveth me much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord is gone out against me. Right? So, okay, everybody's packed up, everybody's ready to go, and now what should you do? No, I don't want you to come with. What's actually happening there? What do you think is actually happening there? Randy. She did give up, right? What else? Wife.
Looking ahead and thinking if she brings the Moabites into Israel, how people are going to look down on her.
Oh, yeah. Right? So when you make a bad decision and there's evidence of it, what do you try and do with that evidence? You try and hide it, right? You don't want anybody else to know. So if I walk back into my hometown with these two Moabites, what are they going to know happened? Right? What's my reputation going to be? Okay? So there's a lot going on there. Peter, go ahead.
Well, that could be definitely part of the scenario also. Just think she had a genuine love for them and thought she was doing them best by, I got no husband's coming for you. Go find yourself a husband. I think she says go back to your like mother's home or whatever and take care of yourself.
Okay.
I got no hope for you.
Okay. So she's thinking, okay, I've got no hope for you. I'll do what's best for you, right? Now, the only question I have with that is if you look at verse 15, right? And this is when she's talking to Ruth. This is after verse 14 where Orpah kissed her mother-in-law and left, right? But Ruth stayed with. In verse 15, and she said, behold, thy sister-in-law is gone back unto her people and unto her gods, right? Return thou after thy sister-in-law. So again, what's the focus that's there? Does she really want what's best for them? It's kind of a mixed bag, just like everything else that Israel's done, right? It's kind of a mixed bag here. We've got the Lord, oh, the Lord's done this to me. Go back to your gods. Wow. Chuck, you had your hand up. Okay.
That, you know that Naomi knew they were false gods. There was only one true God.
Yeah.
And she's sending people back to the false gods.
But she doesn't fully believe God herself, right? She doesn't fully trust God herself, which goes back to our filter question. How much do we trust God for our daily lives, right? Peter was right. There's no hope of husband, so go back. Orpah goes back. Ruth is resolved, though. In verse 16, and Ruth said, entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge, and thy people shall be my people. Oh, what do you mean it doesn't stop there? No, you're right, it doesn't stop there. It goes, and thy God, my God, which is funny because of the situation, right? Because Naomi is this stellar witness for the Lord, right? And the example of her family is just, I think she was probably a pastor's wife or something. I'm not sure, right? And, just drew her in and won her to the Lord and, turned her from her gods of over there, And maybe 15 just happened to be a test for the daughters-in-law to see if they truly loved the Lord or not, right? And that's obviously sarcasm there, right? But yet Ruth saw something. Even in that testimony that Naomi has, however shabby that is, right? There is something that's there. So, what does that tell us about us? Can we still be a witness even though we're terrible at it? Yes. Can our lives still be a witness even though we make mistakes? Yes. Right? Because God is using this mistake for His own good. Chuck?
I think we're all living proof of that.
Yes. right? Exactly. Very good. So, let's see. Let's keep going here. Ruth chapter 2. What's interesting then in Ruth chapter 2? Ruth chapter 2, verse 2. And Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him, in whose sight I shall find grace. And she said unto her, go, my daughter. Right? And then she goes and reaps, and there's this situation. So what do we learn? They come into the city of Bethlehem, and they, there's this fanfare around them, right? Is this Naomi? It's Naomi. Oh my goodness, it's Naomi. Right? And she's all bitter about her stuff, right? In verse 21 of chapter 1, I went out full, and the Lord hath brought me home again empty, right? So there's some bitterness that she has there, and she even changes her name to such. But what do we learn about Ruth in verse 2 of chapter 2? So she's in this foreign city with her mother-in-law who knows the place, and she doesn't. She wants to provide. She wants to work, right? She knows that, in order to sustain life, what must we do? Got to eat, right? Well, you're not doing anything, so I guess I got to, right? So we know that Ruth is willing to work. Okay? Now, what's interesting then is as you turn and look at the circumstances that Naomi and Elimelech and all those guys had, and now it kind of turns for Ruth, right? She just happens by chance to find a field she can work in, right? And this field happens to be owned by Boaz. Boaz just happens to be a kinsman, right? So, what we have here is that God uses the coincidence, the circumstance, right, for his own will, right? He does guide us and direct us sometimes through circumstance. When we're wanting to do what we're supposed to be doing, right? Ben?
He's fully in control of whether we comply or not. That's the wonderful thing about our Heavenly Father.
Right. He's fully in control whether we comply or not. Randy? Yeah, well, they're details when we look back at them, right? And our life is loaded with them. How, well, I had a choice to make here or here, and then I made this choice because that was the information I had at the time. Or that's what I thought God wanted me to do at the time, right? And then years later, you look back at it, man, I can see the path that God had me go, and now I'm where I belong. Peter?
The last verse of Judges, I think, is picturing what we're dealing with in this whole thing. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes.
Yeah.
But then it shows how God overrules it all. They went where they shouldn't have went. But God knew there was a young lady there named Ruth who had a heart towards him.
Right.
And God was going to get her saved.
Right.
So he allowed, if you will, these things. So certain type of wills of God, if you will. Daniel and others, Joseph, when those that walk in obedience to God, how much greater they're blessed. And it makes look at us, how stupid we are sometimes.
Sometimes.
Yeah. Blessings we forfeit because we don't seek God's face and do it his way.
Right. You point out a good thing there in Ruth chapter 1, verses 15 through 17, when Ruth proclaims the end of the verse that Darlene mentioned, and thy God, my God. Who is she pointing her faith in? Right? Who is Naomi not putting her faith in? Okay? And you mentioned like God's plan, right? Because we have in verses, chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, then said Boaz unto Ruth, hearest thou not, my daughter? Go not to glean in another field, neither go from hence, but abide here fast by my maidens. Let thine eyes be on the field that they do reap, and go thou after them. Have I not charged the young men that they shall not touch thee? And when thou art athirst, go unto the vessels, and drink of that which the young men have drawn. Right? And she fell on her face and bowed, and etc. right? But what do we have happening in verses 8 and 9? We've talked about this before, right? Whose plan is this? Right? We've seen it all the way since Genesis 1. Whose plan is this? Right? It's God's plan. God's plan. Okay? Ruth put her faith in God, as evidenced in chapter 1, verse 16. Right? She's trusting in Him. Does she necessarily fully know why due to the testimony of Naomi and her family? No. But she's going to find out. So what happens then in chapter 2, verses 8 and 9? What is she now receiving? Right? Starts with a P. Not yet. That's the next one. Huh? The provision, right? It's God's provision. Did any one of those field owners have to hire a Moabite woman? No. And I would almost venture to guess that this wasn't the first field she went to. Right? They look at her and go, no, we're full, thanks. Right? But yet she found work at this field. And whose field did it just so happen to be?
I'm just a little confused about the gleaning thing, because I thought that the poor people were allowed to go, like, they had certain rules, like they couldn't or they had to round the corners. So I've never thought of her as being hired. I thought of her as this poor reaper behind gleaning the things that were left.
She's in a different status than just the poor random. She's not a full-fledged hired servant. That's what the men were doing. But the poor women, the single women, they were allowed to come in after. But she's getting special treatment here. Because she is told, look, you hang out with my maidens. Not those over there in the fringes. You hang out with my maidens. And what does he also then instruct the men to do? To leave her alone, right? So she has God's protection as well. But besides that, he, Boaz, commands the men, look, she's going to come after you. Look, leave extra behind. Who does that? Right? And not only that, but leave handfuls of the purpose behind. That's the good stuff. Right? Don't leave just the junk behind. Drop a little of the good stuff behind so she can pick it up. Right? And if she's thirsty, hey, look, you go up and say, give me something to drink. Right? So she's got a special status more along the lines of Boaz's maidens and not just random widow poor chick off the street. Chuck.
That's because she came back with Naomi. And Boaz recognized this relationship there. We're just talking forward two stages. Boaz is just doing something that's right. What would be his motivation to do this for this specific woman, a Moabite, right? It's because she came back with Naomi. She was married to his nephew.
I don't know that that's necessarily the full reason. That could be part of it. At the first meeting, he probably doesn't even know, right? Because he has to ask, well, who is this? Right? Whose damsel is this? Right? And then he finds out who she is. And then even later on, it finds out and it calls her, my whole city knows your reputation. But there's time that goes by through this.
Boaz didn't lay out the rules for her until he was told by his servant who she was. And once he found that out, then he set these guidelines for what she could do and protected her. I can only think of one reason other than God telling him directly, right? But I think it's because she's from Elimelech, and she was married to Elimelech's son.
Does he know that at first, though? Well, what I mean by that is, does Boaz know that Naomi was married and is part of that family? Or just that she came back with? Okay. I mean, you can make the jump. It may or not be right. Don't know. It could be part. I mean, because you know that Boaz is a good guy, right? And there's a lot that goes on with Boaz because he knows that if we look at, let's see. Is he having compassion on Naomi or does he like Ruth? Does it stop people now, Chuck? Yoli. Which chapter? Chapter 1, verse 18.
When Ruth said that my people shall be my people and my God, thy God, my God. God
16.
was blessing her for having that desire.
Yeah. God's blessing her for having the desire. How did you two get married? Right? How did you two first meet? Right? Don't answer that question. Right? Right? Clinton Bell, think about how you first met. Ben and Valerie, think about how you first met. Right? And the circumstances that are there. Right? Similar things are going on there. If Boaz was a jerk, would they get married? No. Right? Well, see, the trick to it is, and we should jump there just to make sure that we don't miss it, is chapter 3, verse 9. Chapter 3, verse 9. And he said, this is Boaz, who art thou? And she answered, I am Ruth thine handmaid. Spread therefore thy skirt over thine handmaid, for thou art a near kinsman. And in verse 10 he said, and blessed be thou of the Lord, my daughter, for thou hast showed more kindness in the latter end than at the beginning, inasmuch as thou followest not young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, fear not, I will do to thee all that thou requirest, for all the city of my people doth know that thou art a virtuous woman. Okay, so there is time, right? We have 4 chapters of Ruth, right? There is time that's gone by, a season of reaping that she's been there, okay? And he's paid attention to her while she has done her job, okay? And in chapter 3, verse 1, Naomi is seeking rest for her, right? Somehow, some sort of provision for her for the future, okay? So now they know that Boaz is a near kinsman, okay? How many are familiar with the kinsman redeemer? Not many. Okay, great. Then we'll cover that quick. So, Jewish rule, husband, wife. Husband dies. Wife to be provided for can marry brother, unmarried brother in the family to carry on that lineage. Okay? But there's a trick to it. And verse 9 is that trick, right? She has to ask for it. It is not an assumed right. Just because wife dies, brother doesn't get her. She has to ask for it. And that's what's happening here in verse 9. She's going to Boaz and asking for him to perform that duty. Does she have to? No. Well, Naomi suggested the whole situation, but what else? But it is up to her. But do the two like each other independently? What does Boaz know? She's a virtuous woman. The whole city knows it, right? She's a virtuous woman. What else does he know? Verse 13 of chapter 3. We'll start in 12. And now it is true, I am thy near kinsman. Howbeit, there is a kinsman nearer than I. Tarry this night, and it shall be in the morning, that if he will perform unto thee the part of a kinsman, well, let him do the kinsman's part. But if he will not do the part of a kinsman to thee, then I will do the part of the kinsman to thee, as the Lord liveth. Lie down until the morning. What does he know? Did he have to check? Did he have to check? This conversation is hilarious to me in the middle of the night because my wife has woken me up before in the middle of the night and tried to tell me something important. And I'm like, wait, what? You know, but Boaz is fairly coherent here. You know, I give him props for that. And he knows right away. Why does he know? He's been thinking about it, right? Why has he been thinking about it? He was hoping she would ask, right? Okay, flip that around. Flip that around on us, right? And the picture of Christ that we have here, right? Does God force salvation upon us? No. He offers it. The redemption is there if you want it. Right? Just like with Boaz. Ruth, Boaz is there if you want it. Does Boaz force himself upon her? No. Does God force himself upon us? No. When we come to God and ask for that free gift of salvation, what does he do? Gives it to us, right? When Ruth comes to Boaz, what's his intentions? To do it, right? Now, obviously, you have a human comparison to a godly comparison, right? So, I mean, it's not like, well, God will save you if he can, right? No, it's done, it's paid for, it's all there. You have to accept the gift. You have to ask for it, right? That's the key verse in the book of Ruth, right? All of it is a build-up to it. How good is Boaz to Ruth up until this point? Pretty good, right? Provides for her, protects her, gives her a little extra, right? How good was God to you before you got saved? Right? You were still alive to get saved, weren't you? Right? For some of us, that's bigger than others, right? You know, despite the things that we've done there, okay? So, there is that comparison. If you don't see that comparison, you miss the whole book of Ruth, right? Because when Ruth in chapter 1, in verse 16, like Yoli pointed out again, my God is your God, or your God is my God, sorry, right? And she's showing that little bit of faith despite the family situation she came from. What can God do with that? Because she's willing, right? And we've talked about this over and over, I think, where God doesn't use the great, God doesn't use the mighty, God doesn't use the rich, God uses the willing, right? And she shows that little bit of willing, and God reveals himself more and more in the example of Boaz to her. Because like, I think it was Darlene, is either that or Sandy, pointed out where a widow woman on her own with a Moabite woman, right? Living in that day and age, good luck to you. You're having a hard time. And where does she end up? She ends up married. She ends up having a son, right? Ruth's now in the line of Christ. Check Matthew 1. and Naomi gets to come along for that ride, right? So whose faith shows who what's better, right? The verse in, it's probably Proverbs, right? Iron sharpeneth iron, so doth the man sharpen the countenance of his friend, right? Where one person's faith sharpens another person's faith, and they kind of snowball and grow together. Peter.
I have to think that she, in her search for God in her life, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
saw the emptiness of the idols that she was familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
And God was revealing that to her, that this isn't it.
Yeah.
And being,
Despite Naomi's best efforts.
I'm sure that Naomi that told the stories, whether they were living their life. I have a
Sure.
feeling they shared their stories of their Lord, delivering out of Egypt and all that. And her, and her hunger for truth, I think the Spirit of God helped to recognize the truth of all that.
Wanted to see that.
She came to that point where your God's going to be my God, because my God, they don't have that.
Sure, yeah. And then if we look at chapter 4, verse 9. And Boaz said unto the elders and unto all the people, Ye are witnesses this day that I have bought all that was Elimelech's and all that was Chilion's and Mahlon's of the hand of Naomi. Moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of Mahlon, have I purchased to be my wife, etc., etc., etc. Right? Should remind you of 1 Corinthians chapter 6, right? 19, 20, something like that, where we are bought with a price. At redemption, we are bought with a price. All right, and with that, we have to conclude our epic adventure through God's Word today. Y'all are dismissed.